Hola de nuevo.
Hola, hola, hola.
Continuamos esta mañana interesante. Por cierto, que saludamos a quienes nos siguen vía streaming, porque no solo estamos aquí los que lo estamos siguiendo presencialmente, sino también al otro lado. Así que para eso somos digitales, ¿no? Y para eso estamos hablando de tecnología.
Totalmente. Y mira que la sala está llena, pero es que somos muchos más hoy presentes. Nada, seguimos con la mañana.
Sí, estamos
Esto
de vuelta
va
ya
increciendo.
con otro panel muy interesante también. En este caso, el tema de la mesa va a ser la educación basada en evidencias, clases para reducir la inequidad educativa. Y sus integrantes son Kim Bullen, Head of Evaluation de la Education Endowment Foundation, el profesor Nuno Crato, ISEGI, presidente de Iniciativa Educação.
Y también va a estar Marta Ferrero, que es vicedecana en Investigación y Transferencia Docente en la Facultad de Formación del Profesorado y Educación de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Y en esta mesa, la moderadora va a ser María Espinet, que es responsable del Departamento de Educación de la Fundación La Caixa.
Pues vamos con ellos, un fuerte aplauso.
Well, welcome everyone, and we're very happy to be here with Kim, with Nuno, with Marta, representing different contexts in terms of nationality, but also in terms of university, public, and philanthropy, and the EF in terms of research. So very happy to be here. And why are we asking this question to ourselves, and why Fundación La Caixa especially asks this question? When we talk about equity in education, there is a research that we share with EF that worries us a lot, that says that there is a difference of 20 months of learning from the students that are coming from the socioeconomic high socioeconomic backgrounds and low socioeconomic backgrounds. This means that there are students here in Spain, but also in the UK, that lives higher education with a level of segundo de la ESO, por ejemplo. Well, we're going to be changing languages, segundo de la ESO, y algunos que salen con cuarto de la ESO también, ¿no? Esta diferencia después se perpetúa a lo largo de su vida, tanto a nivel personal como profesional. Esta diferencia nos preocupa específicamente en Fundación La Caixa y por eso estamos apostando para la línea de evidencias. Y la primera pregunta que os voy a lanzar, first question for all of you, is going to be about what do we mean when we talk about evidence-based education and why evidence-based education is related to equity. For example, Nuno.
Me? Okay. Well, thank you for the question and thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Evidence, I prefer the term evidence-informed education, like in medicine. Medicine is informed by science, but it doesn't mean that when a doctor is operating, a surgeon has to do exactly this way. He would adapt the way, but he knows a lot of anatomy and then a lot of pathology in order to operate correctly. So, and I'd say that evidence that informs education should be varied. We have, as teachers, we know a lot. We know a lot. We have been teaching for a while, especially me. We have been teaching for a while. So when we hear something like, oh, students should discover everything by themselves, well, come on, we know that's not possible. So, or when we hear things like, students now are completely different. They learn in a different way. We say, oh, maybe, well, I've been here in this profession for quite a while. And essentially, students learn in the same way. They have to understand how things work and so on in order to understand them. But nowadays, and also in terms of rationality, because we look at some theories that appear in education, you say, oh, this doesn't make any sense, so let's be critical about it. But nowadays, there is quite a revolution in education. I'd say a revolution, because we have at least 4 areas in which we have done fantastic leaps. The first area is about data. So let's just think that by the middle of the 20th century, people didn't know whether Angola was doing well compared to Bangladesh, and nowadays we know. Because nowadays we have international surveys such as PISA, TEAMS, PEARLS, and so on. And that's a trove of data. That's lots of data. That's data from many, many, many countries, and for 25 years or so. If we go to America, then we have for a longer period. But we have data as we never thought before. And for instance, we can analyze this data for simple things such as this. What's better for students in order to develop literacy? Is it better to read simple texts? It turns out it's better to read fiction, which is kind of surprising. This is a study by John Jerem from UCL, I believe. And he did a study with all these fantastic data, and he realized that the best thing to be literate and to communicate is to read fiction. Wow, who would think about that? Charles Dickens comes back. Okay, so then we have in economics. In economics, we have quite a revolution. The people talk about a credibility revolution in econometrics when they talk about counterfactual methods that appear now. So it's economics, but essentially it's statistics. It's new methods to analyze a complex set of factors and try to disentangle from that where are the causal relations. And economists of education, you could call them statisticians of education, analyze now things such as class size. Is that important for having better learning or not? And other things. And then, of course, we have cognitive psychology. I won't talk much about it, but cognitive psychology is something that didn't exist, let's say, 50 years ago. Even the name didn't exist. So, and people like psychologists who do like Skinner and all these guys who do response, stimulus response, and they wouldn't care much about how this works. And how this works is something very new. We now know we have working memory, we have a long-term memory, we have to pay attention to things. What is in our working memory is what we learn. We can't learn just sleeping and listening to music. We don't learn listening to videos. So we know a lot about psychology nowadays that we didn't know some time ago. And so we talk about Piaget and so on. All these guys were great, but they passed away decades ago. And we have so we have lots of new evidence, and of course we have neurosciences. We don't know how neurosciences are going to revolutionize things, but it's unbelievable that people now know, for instance, that when we make additions, 2 + 3, we activate an area of the brain. And when we do subtractions, 5 - 3, we activate a different area of the brain. This is amazing how people can know that. We don't know if this is useful. It will be. So my hope is that we have lots of evidence, and so we can make education much better if we pay attention to the evidence and also if you use our critical thinking.
Mm-hmm. So interesting, no, to see what is evidence for you, and you have already discussed 4 types of different evidence that we can use now and in the future. What about you, Kim?
Yeah, so this is, I mean, such an interesting topic. I think, there is this constant building of new evidence, which is really, really exciting. And in the field of education, there's so much innovation going on, right? We're constantly trying new things, testing new things out, and that's the really crucial piece, is this testing element. And it's a big part of what we do at the Education Endowment Foundation. So we're constantly in the space of trying to generate new evidence, and I'll kind of give you an example of this and what this might look like, and why this is just so crucial. A few years ago, we evaluated a really popular program called Achievement for All. And in theory, this is one of those innovations that sounds like such a great idea. So this is a 2-year program where head teachers work with this organization to do some really bespoke coaching. They work with the head teacher to really help them develop their leadership skills, thinking about school-wide learning and skill development, thinking about parental engagement, thinking about lots of school-wide metrics. It's bespoke to what the school needs, and really helps them to kind of adapt as they need. This is a really popular program in England. They have worked with 4,000 schools. So we decided we wanted to test this out. So let's really understand, does this work and how does it work? We ran this, we evaluated this using a randomized control trial, which is a really common method used in medical science as well. And we recruited 134 schools that were really interested in running this program in their school. We randomly allocated half of them to receive this program, and half were asked to just carry on with their business as usual, so whatever they would have otherwise done that particular year. They carried out the program for 2 years, and at the end we looked at pupil outcomes. Did the school, did this program actually improve outcomes for pupils? Really surprisingly, we found that pupil outcomes were poorer in schools that had received this program than the schools that did not. So that means, really in practical terms, they had poorer reading scores and they had poorer math scores than the schools that didn't have the program. Now, to get to the equity piece on this, for every program that we fund and that we evaluate at the Education Endowment Foundation, we always look at the impact on pupils who are in receipt of free school meals. So that's our indicator of socioeconomic disadvantage. We also found then that the outcomes were poorer for those pupils as well. This is a really popular program. In theory, I mean, I don't think anybody sitting in this room would go, oh, that must make outcomes worse for kids. You know, we were as surprised as anybody else, and there's a number of theories as to why we think that this might have happened. I can't get into those today, it'll take too much time, but the report is available on our website if you're curious about it. But if we hadn't tested this program, we would have never known that, and it would have carried on potentially making outcomes worse for pupils, and particularly for the pupils that we most are keen to support. So this is what we, you know, when we think about really driving, you know, using evidence, this is a really key piece of it. Now, obviously, I've used the horror story here, like the worst possible scenario of something that actually is making outcomes worse, and obviously we've been testing lots of different programs over the decade of our existence, and we found some that don't appear to have any better outcomes than what schools are otherwise routinely doing, and we found some that seem to have really promising outcomes, which is really exciting. And even for those programs, if we find, yes, this appears to improve outcomes, that's not enough for us. We say we're testing it again, and we're going to take it to more schools and a more diverse population and make sure we can still see that impact when we get to more kids and more different types of kids. And again, always looking at our kids who are in receipt of free school meals. And beyond that too, it's not just enough to say, did it work, but also how did it work? So that we can really start to unpack some lessons of, you know, is this about improving teacher workload? Is this about improving teacher skill development? There's lots of different ways that this might come about. But it's really important for us to be continually developing that evidence and then pushing it out in a really accessible way for teachers to use.
It is really interesting and sometimes frightening that goodwill and good intentions actually have a poor impact, especially on those who are most in need. And all that energy that all these teachers and head leaders and philanthropies or governments are putting to improve education, and then it actually has a worse impact, which makes their lives more difficult in the long run, in the long term. So I think the evidence also needs to help us to make these decisions wisely for social justice, I would say. And what about you, Marta?
A mí me gustaría matizar el término, ¿verdad? Educación basada en la evidencia, y lo hago precisamente en castellano porque tiene matices muy diferentes el término en inglés y en castellano, lo hablábamos antes, y en nuestro país quizá eso ha llevado a confusiones con consecuencias negativas para la comunidad educativa. En castellano la palabra evidencia es sinónimo de certeza, de algo que ya está probado, que no se tiene que demostrar. Y esto es todo lo contrario a lo que hace tan valiosa la ciencia, que está todo el tiempo poniéndose a revisión, ¿no? Es falsable y es lo que le da el gran valor que tiene. Y está además el término basado, educación basada en la evidencia, que ha hecho que los docentes en activo hayan tomado este enfoque como que los investigadores son los que prescriben qué es lo que hay que hacer en las aulas, y los docentes se convierten en meros ejecutores de lo que les dicen los investigadores, ¿eh? Y por tanto pierden toda la autoridad, ¿no?, dentro de los centros escolares. Antes hablábamos, ¿qué término es oficial en nuestro idioma? No sé si lo hay, creo que lo tenemos que crear. A mí me gusta mucho hablar de educación informada desde la investigación o guiada por la investigación. La verdad es que todavía no sé cuál es el mejor, ¿no? Pero creo que son dos términos que acercan un poquito el sentido de este enfoque y lo que puede aportar a la educación. Y es que la experiencia que tienen los docentes, la propia y la de colegas que están cerca, los conocimientos que se van adquiriendo, las intuiciones que uno desarrolla como docente dentro del aula, yo lo he sido, lo he vivido, los valores que a uno lo acompañan como persona y por tanto como docente también, son fuentes de información cruciales a la hora de trabajar en un centro escolar como docente, pero no son suficientes para garantizar una toma de decisiones óptima. Esta sabiduría práctica es muy necesaria pero no es suficiente. Y aquí es donde la investigación puede hacer una gran contribución, como una fuente de información más, ¿verdad? Es un recurso más, un compañero de viaje para los docentes que yo diría que facilita una apuesta más segura por garantizar una mejor toma de decisiones. Y, lógicamente, esto conduce a una mayor equidad. A mí me gusta muchísimo hablar a los docentes de la letra pequeña. Creo que la investigación aporta letra pequeña a métodos, recursos, estrategias de aprendizaje que existen, ¿no? Por poner un ejemplo, gracias a la investigación sabemos que el aprendizaje basado en proyectos, muchos de los que estamos aquí, sobre todo si tenéis hijos, hijas, os sonará, que es una forma de trabajo muy activa, pero se sabe que necesita una serie de requisitos para ser eficaz, ¿no? Entre otros, que los estudiantes tengan una serie de conocimientos previos adquiridos, que sean capaces de trabajar en equipo, que sean capaces de autorregularse, de mantenerse, de perseverar en la tarea. Si esto no existe, el aprendizaje basado en proyectos no es eficaz. Y no lo es sobre todo en alumnado, en este caso, más novel, con dificultades de aprendizaje. Si queremos una educación de calidad para todos, equitativa, necesitamos conocer esta letra pequeña y nos la brinda la investigación, ¿no?
Sí, clarísimamente. Y me gusta mucho el concepto, ¿no?, que estás compartiendo de las evidencias como una herramienta que te acompaña como docente, nunca como algo que te impone, ¿no?, qué tienes que hacer, porque tú como docente ya tienes este conocimiento y esta contextualización, porque que también es muy importante, ¿no?
Sí.
De mi aula, de mi centro, pero sí, obviamente, siempre en el corazón teniendo a los más vulnerables, ¿no?, para esta buena toma de decisiones. Muy interesante esta primera significado de educación basada en evidencias. La segunda pregunta que os quería lanzar es ¿cuáles son las principales palancas que hacen que la educación basada en evidencias sea una realidad en nuestro sistema educativo? What are the key levers for evidence-based education in our schooling system, for example, Kim?
Sure. So at the EEF, we kind of base our work around three core levers. We generate evidence, we synthesize evidence, and we mobilize that evidence. And I'll kind of go into those a little bit more. So in terms of generating evidence, it's a little bit like what I described in my last example. So it's trying to generate the highest quality evidence. Most of the time that does come down to RCTs, which I think, sorry, randomized control trials, which I think is a bit surprising that we're using sort of what's used in medicine to kind of understand the impact of programs in education. But why wouldn't we want the same standard for our children as we do for our health interventions, for example? This helps us to understand whether a new program, an innovation, a tool is having an impact, and if so, how that's happening in practice. It may seem, I guess, surprising. So we've been around for 10 years in England, and it's taken quite a long time to kind of build up this culture around it. But to date, 23,000 schools in England have taken part in a randomized control trial testing out an educational intervention, which is quite shocking, I think, in a lot of contexts. That's 1.8 million pupils who have taken part in these to help us understand, you know, when we're introducing new programs and practices, do they actually work? And do they work better than what schools are already doing, which is really crucial for, you know, again, to prevent those backfires, but also to make sure we're spending our money in the best possible way to ensure the best possible outcomes. Moving on, we then synthesize evidence. We're not the only shop in town. There are lots of other people who are doing really high quality research. So we have a team that pulls together research findings across the globe to help create a clearer picture on what the evidence says on a number of different types of interventions. So for example, tutoring is a really popular one for us. It pulls together all the evidence that we can find to kind of create a clearer picture in a really accessible sense. And this is part of our teaching and learning toolkit, which is available for free on our website. It's probably our most kind of popular offering that we have, and it's a tool that's available to anybody that sets out the kind of the picture around impact and cost for particularly popular types of project interventions. And to date, this represents research findings from 2,600 studies from across the globe. That's not enough, though, to have the evidence and to kind of put it into accessible. It's been about mobilizing that evidence. So where we find programs that seem promising, we support them to scale. So we're a funder, and we do support programs to scale so that they can reach more schools. But then that's also kind of getting to this evidence-informed decision-making and evidence-informed practices. So At the policy level, we're really fortunate to have a good relationship with our Department for Education, so we're helping them to access the evidence and to make evidence-informed policy where we can. Then we move down at the school level, where in the English context, school leaders have a lot of autonomy around their spending and what they choose to adopt in their schools. They also have a special pot of money that is specifically for pupils who receive free school meals to ensure they're getting additional targeted supports. So it's providing that evidence to them so they can also make the right decision. So looking at the evidence, thinking about their context, their school, their pupils, and thinking about what's right for them. And then it's supporting teachers to also kind of think about their individual practices in the classroom. We're really fortunate at this point, 70% of school leaders in England use our teaching and learning toolkit. So they're accessing that evidence and really using that to make the decisions. So those are kind of our three key
Let me
points.
jump here. As the main partner of the EF here in Spain, we actually translated and contextualized this toolkit, and we launched a new version in June this year. So this toolkit is like the greatest tool that I've ever seen in making very easy for everyone to access more than 2,600 studies, because like, who has time to read that? We need to make an effort as well as philanthropies and to make it easy for school leaders, but also for anyone in education to make sure their decisions are based on evidence. So I really encourage you to check it out in our webpage. And for example, Marta, what do you think are the key levers? ¿Cuáles son las principales palancas?
Aquí en nuestro país, yo hablaría de palanca y reto, es promover una mayor cultura científica en nuestra sociedad en general, creo, pero lógicamente aquí me voy a centrar en la comunidad educativa. Y trabajo en una facultad de educación, luego me toca hablar de las tareas que quedan pendientes, ¿no?, en las facultades de educación de nuestro país. Creo que tenemos que hacer un gran trabajo de acercar la investigación a los futuros docentes. Creo que tenemos que hablar desde la investigación. Tenemos que fortalecer un poco más la formación en métodos de investigación, cómo acceder a la investigación, dónde está la literatura científica, enseñar a diferenciar la buena de la mala investigación, que también existe y esa no nos vale, ¿verdad? Si no logramos esto durante los estudios de educación, si no logramos que se asocie irremediablemente educación e investigación, los docentes ya en activo, cuando estén en sus centros escolares, no van a necesitar la investigación. Y es lo que ocurre ahora, que a veces ni está ni se la espera. Y esto lo tenemos que solucionar. Creo, además, que hay muchas razones, ¿no?, que explican esta falta de cultura científica en la comunidad educativa. Una de ellas quizá es que faltan incentivos para que las personas que hacemos investigación dediquemos realmente tiempo a labores de transferencia y de divulgación, que no son nada fáciles. Adaptar los hallazgos al lenguaje y a las necesidades de un centro escolar no es fácil. Y hay ocasiones en las que un hallazgo, tanto en educación como en otra área del saber, no tiene implicaciones claras y a veces no hay que buscarlas, pero cuando las tiene, no se puede quedar en un artículo científico al que tienen acceso muy pocas personas. Porque, por cierto, a diferencia de los hospitales, los centros escolares no tienen acceso a las bases científicas. Aunque quisieran, no podrían acceder a la literatura científica. Por eso es tan importante la labor de transferencia y divulgación, y en este sentido el toolkit de la Education Endowment Foundation es realmente una maravilla, ¿verdad? Porque incluso a veces, aunque los docentes tuvieran las herramientas, estuvieran pertrechados de las herramientas para acceder e interpretar la investigación, lo apuntabas, María, ¿quién tiene tiempo para leer cientos de publicaciones científicas? A veces ni los propios científicos podemos ir al ritmo, yo la primera, ¿no?, que impone hoy en día la ciencia. Y por último, creo que también sería una buena palanca el fomentar, ya existen y cada vez más, hoy esto es una prueba de ello, estamos hablando de educación desde la investigación, desde la ciencia aquí, ¿verdad? Y hay otros muchos pasos que estamos dando, pero creo que hay que trabajar mucho en crear espacios comunes para investigadores y educadores, para conocer la forma de trabajar de cada uno de ellos, las inquietudes, compartir un lenguaje común, que se necesiten, que se conozcan, que se busquen, que se cree una colaboración, que no se entienda una labor sin la otra. Creo que eso sería muy, muy deseable.
No, definitivamente. Nosotros también desde Fundación entendemos, hay una frase que me encanta que es teaching is an intellectual profession, ¿no? La enseñanza es una profesión intelectual y como profesión intelectual requiere de espacios de reflexión basada en la investigación, ¿no? Pero esto es como un cambio cultural, ¿no? Tenemos que entender la educación como intellectual profession y entonces vamos a, obviamente, necesitar, ¿no? esta relación con la universidad tan estrecha. Y también nos pasa que en nuestras convocatorias de evidencias hemos puesto en común universidades haciendo pilotajes quasi experimental y escuelas, y es el momento en que se encuentran, es increíble ver cómo la universidad dice, es increíble la dedicación, el engagement que le pone el docente, y el docente está muy agradecido de tener un acompañamiento universitario. Es decir, en el momento que se ponen juntos es el éxito asegurado. El problema también es cómo fomentamos, ¿no? esta unión. Qué interesante, Marta. And what do you think, Nona? What are the key levers?
Key levers. I think one of the key levers is the one that you just said, the toolkit. And it's great that toolkit is translated. In Portugal, we have a similar thing. We have Iniciativa Educação, the foundation at which I work. We do weekly, we write weekly articles, translational articles. So articles that translate research that is being developed in lay terms, so that everybody, that I can read them, I can understand them. And I think this, to be updated with what is being done, is very important. And we are, nosotros españoles y portugueses somos un poco, no somos tan felices como los ingleses, porque los ingleses pueden hacer RCT, nosotros no podemos hacer, para nosotros es mucho más difícil. Mucho más difícil, porque ellos tienen un sistema educativo que es muy diverso, que es muy descentralizado, y nosotros no, es un sistema muy centralizado. When we do, sorry, let's go back to English. When we do our RCT, we would need like lots of resources and so on. For you, it's much easier. But we can look at what other people did, right? We can look at what other people, and we have lots of evidence now. So we have lots of evidence from very diverse things. So from this toolkit, for what you say, from similar things in the United States and in other countries, and also from psychology of education, we know lots of things. We were used some time ago to go to a conference in education, and someone would appear and would say, oh, I have this fantastic novelty. Now this is going to be fantastic. And I tried it, and you tried it when? Oh, I tried it in my class. Okay, in a class. Oh, okay. I tried it, and it was fantastic. Students were very happy, and so on. And at the end, if someone would ask the inconvenient question, did they learn more? Oh, I didn't measure that. We don't measure those things. Education is something more general than it's not measurable. Okay. So let's talk about real education, and we need to distinguish what's education that takes decades, like to understand the brain, for instance. One thing that everybody is talking about is to develop critical thinking. Now, the psychologists know that this is not a generic domain that we can develop. We cannot develop critical thinking if we don't know something about the subject, right? Am I saying, estoy diciendo bien? Okay, ella es la experta, no soy. We cannot develop these things like cooperation. Cooperation with what? Cooperation doing something. So we have to engage in the task. We don't learn just because we are active. We learn because we pay attention to the things, because things come through this narrow channel called working memory, and we think about it. We learn what we think about. It's not of what we are engaged with. It's what we think about. And engagement means mental engagement. All these type of things are known now. We know much more than we knew 20 years ago, when or 50 years ago when Piaget was doing his observations, very interesting, obviously. And we know that knowledge builds upon knowledge. So we know much more, and we should pay attention to this type of things. And I think that people such as Marta, such as you, who know a lot about what's going on and who can read papers, who can read what's being done, have really a duty. ¿Puedo decir que tienes el deber? They have a duty to translate things to people and to make available these things. I talked about the literacy effect, that PISA and so on, analyzing these things. So this is quite a boost for teachers of literature, because we can tell them, look, your students should read complex texts because that's what's needed. And sometimes we try to approach the business world in the wrong way, because we think, sometimes you business people tell us, oh, they can't read a manual for a motor. Well, if they could read Shakespeare or I don't know, Cervantes or José Celas, if they could read, then they can read the motor. It's not something that we just narrow down to a specific thing. Or Excel is another thing. Many people from business say, oh, they don't even know how to do an Excel in business. Okay, to do an Excel, we can learn in 2 weeks. What we cannot learn in 2 weeks is what's the difference between the exponential function and the linear function. And we need this for putting in the Excel, because the Excel needs to understand what's a log, what's an exponential, what are the properties of these functions, what are the rules for, what are algebraic precedence rules. So when we put a formula in Excel, we have to translate something that is in our mind to the Excel. We know math to do that. So going back to this, when we are at the outset, we look and we say, oh, they don't know what's an Excel. But we should say, they don't know algebra.
How interesting to go deeply, no, when we think in education, not to stay in the surface. Thank you very much. And we're going to go to the next question, more like appealing to who are we here as well, and how can different agents involved in education, especially third sector, philanthropies, etc., can help build this evidence-based education, evidence-informed practice, and how can they contribute in improving equity in schooling, for example, Marta?
Creo que todas las personas que de una u otra forma estamos implicadas en educación tenemos una grandísima responsabilidad, ¿no? También empresas, entidades en general, que de alguna forma aportan materiales, recursos, métodos, etc. Me gustaría poner a través de ejemplos, hablar a través de ejemplos de la importancia que tiene que también estas empresas, este tercer sector, tengan en cuenta la investigación, ¿verdad? Cuando se sumerge en el apasionante mundo de la educación. Barro para mi terreno, yo sobre todo he hecho investigación en lectoescritura. Es un territorio muy curioso. Digamos que la competencia lectora quizá es el mayor predictor del éxito laboral y por tanto vital de una persona, pero las diferencias de partida entre nosotros son muy diferentes. Hay niños, niñas que van a aprender a leer a pesar de lo que hagamos, van a aprender a leer solos, pero hay un 6-7% de la población que si no recibe el mejor método para aprender a leer, no va a dominar la lectura nunca, no va a tener una lectura libre de errores y a una velocidad adecuada que le permita comprender. Y eso va a comprometer seriamente su vida personal, laboral. Veis que soy muy sensible con este tema. Cuando surgen nuevas propuestas educativas en torno a la enseñanza de la lectura o de la escritura y entran, antes Nuno hablaba de revolución, a mí no me gusta hablar de revolución en educación porque impone una velocidad que en educación no es buena, porque la ciencia funciona despacio. Y a mí me gusta siempre decir en educación que prefiero estar a la penúltima. Y sin embargo, creo que hay un exceso de innovación educativa malentendida, de muchas propuestas que llegan a los centros escolares y que todavía no han tenido un recorrido suficiente. Están entrando con mucha fuerza ahora las TIC en educación y desde luego son un recurso, yo diría, crucial y pueden traer muy buenos aportes a este terreno, pero hay, por ejemplo, mucha aplicación en torno a las tabletas para enseñar a escribir a niños de primero de primaria, cuando cada vez hay más investigación que dice que es mucho, mucho más eficaz aprender a leer de manera manual, porque los patrones motores que acompañan a la mano, junto con la información fonológica, semántica de las palabras, son una pista más para que los niños aprendan ese sistema arbitrario que para ellos es endiablado, porque son garabatos que no significan nada, ¿no? Y lo mismo con la escritura, con la lectura o la comprensión lectora, que es el talón de Aquiles que tenemos en nuestro país, lo dicen indicadores externos como PISA. Hay mucha investigación cada vez más, por cierto, mucha en nuestro país. Hay un equipo potentísimo en Valencia, ERI Lectura, que están encontrando hallazgos robustos, sólidos, sobre que leer en soporte digital, en personas que están aprendiendo todavía a comprender los textos, no es adecuado, porque tiene muchos distractores un texto digital, entre otras ventanas emergentes que entran, que salen, y que es mucho más eficaz, de nuevo, el soporte papel para trabajar la comprensión lectora en personas que todavía no han consolidado el aprendizaje lector, ¿no? Luego, intentando cerrar y responder a tu pregunta, que me estoy yendo mucho, María, ¿qué pueden hacer empresas, tercer sector, para contribuir a una educación equitativa para todos? Pues tener también en cuenta lo que dice la investigación en materia educativa, incorporar en sus equipos intermediarios o científicos o ponerse en contacto con centros de investigación, universidades, a la hora de desarrollar recursos, aplicaciones educativas.
Totalmente de acuerdo, ¿no? Y esto está muy ligado a lo que estamos comentando de la profundidad, ¿no?, necesaria cada vez que hacemos un paso hacia adelante a nivel educativo, ¿no?, que tenga ese impacto y que tenga sobre todo el corazón aquellos más vulnerables, ¿no? Ese 6% que nos decías que si no consigue la mínima comprensión lectora va a tener un efecto en su vida, sobre todo el proyecto vital, ¿no?, que eso también nos preocupa muchísimo. Nos quedan 3 minutos, pero me gustaría que, no sé si en 1 minuto y medio cada uno, in a minute and a half, maybe you can bring some light in this contribution of the third sector, philanthropy, in making this education have more impact. Okay.
Sure. So, I mean, we're talking about a lot of interesting findings here, but there's still so much we don't know about what works in education, and particularly for low-income pupils. So there's still so much to learn. And I'm thinking, about funders, there's often a lot of enthusiasm for funding exciting new innovations and new interventions. And it would be great to see that same level of enthusiasm and funding for evaluating those interventions and innovations and making sure we really understand that they work. For the developers themselves, it's having that really openness to being critically evaluated and making sure it's achieving the outcomes that you want. Back to what Nuno said, a lot of times there's an enthusiasm to report that kids really liked it, teachers really liked it, it went really well. But did it actually impact the outcomes we care about? And in comparison to what? I think that's the other big piece here. And then with everything, it's always having that equity lens in mind. So do we expect this to work for our low-income pupils? And do we expect there might be any barriers to access? And I think that one's really crucial to keep in mind and really monitoring that throughout to make sure that we're not unintentionally continuing to widen this gap rather than closing it as we hope.
I love it. Equity and funding research. I love it. And Nuno, you have 1 minute and 20 seconds.
Okay. I will try. 2 things.
Okay.
First thing, I believe we are talking mostly for people in business, or many people in business in this room.
Sector,
okay.
Teachers?
Okay. No business here? Yes, business? Okay.
Some.
Okay.
A combination.
I'm losing time. Let me go fast.
Go.
First thing, innovation in business equals good. Because when you innovate, you create a new product, you open new perspectives. Innovation in education doesn't mean good. It means change. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not. So it's a different thing in education and in business. So be careful with education with innovation in education. It's not necessarily good. It can be very damaging indeed. First thing. Second thing, if you people from business and you teachers want to cooperate, I think there is an area in which we can cooperate, and that area is vocational training. Because schools, vocational training, so, ¿cómo se dice en castellano? Educación profesional. Because vocational training is an area in which business can tell what is needed, can support with materials, with facilities, with premises, with trainees and so on, and where schools can tell to students what they need to know. So schools can teach physics, and then business can teach how to work with machines, and the two things together create a vocational training that is much better than what we have had so far. And the countries who do really vocational training well do this partnership between the industry and schooling. In Iniciativa Educação, we try to help schools doing and business doing that, but I think this is something that is of value to everybody.
It's such a great topic. We have formación profesional is another hot topic, but we have 30 seconds. Amazing. To end this panel, thank you very much, Kim from London, to join us here, Nuno from Portugal, and Marta having all this context here in Spain. And thank you for encouraging us and making us more passionate about how science and research can contribute in our practice as teachers, as a schooling community, as philanthropies, as people who care about education, which I think this is what brings us all together here in Enlighted, that we care about education and that we for sure will have those more vulnerable at heart when we work on our daily life. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And yeah.
Thank you.